What if one of the most familiar peoples of Europe didn't always belong to Europe at all? What if traces of ancient Germanic tribes were found not near the Rhine, not in Scandinavia, but thousands of kilometers to the east, deep inside what is now modern Russia? This is not a theory. It's not folklore. And it's not nationalist myth-making. It's what genetics, archaeology, and historical records quietly started agreeing on, long after historians thought the story of the Germanic peoples was already finished. For centuries, the origin story seemed simple. Germanic tribes emerged somewhere in northern Europe. They moved west and south. They collided with Rome. They shaped medieval Europe. Case closed. But DNA doesn't care about tidy narratives. Over the last 2 decades, something unexpected began to surface from burial grounds far outside the Germanic world. Skeletons unearthed in regions stretching across Eastern Europe, the Eurasian steppe, and deep into the territory of modern Russia started to tell a different story, one written not in chronicles, but in chromosomes. Genetic markers once thought to be distinctly Germanic were appearing far beyond their supposed homeland. And they weren't rare. They weren't accidental. They were clustered, repeating, persistent. At first, researchers treated this as contamination, coincidence, or later migration. But as datasets grew and sequencing became more precise, the pattern refused to disappear. The question became unavoidable. Why were ancient Germanic genetic signatures showing up thousands of kilometers east of where Germanic tribes were supposed to exist? To answer that, scientists had to rethink who the heroes of this story really were. Not kings, not warriors, not famous names from Roman texts. The true protagonists are entire populations, and the scientists who learn to interrogate the past molecule by molecule. Modern geneticists step into this story like detectives arriving at a cold case scene. Their tools are not swords or maps, but Y-chromosomes, mitochondrial DNA, and statistical models capable of comparing the dead with the living across millennia. Through them, ancient people speak again, and what they reveal immediately complicates everything. The term Germanic turns out to be far less geographic than we imagined, less fixed, less European. Instead of a single homeland, the data points to a wide, shifting zone of interaction, one that stretched across forest, river, and steppe, from Central Europe into territories now associated with Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and Turkic histories. Burials dated to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in parts of Western Russia show genetic affinities closer to early Germanic populations than to later local groups. These individuals lived centuries before written sources ever mentioned Goths, Vandals, or Lombards, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if some of the peoples we later called Germanic didn't originate where we thought, but were shaped by long-term movement eastward and back again? Or more provocatively, what if parts of what became Germanic identity were forged far from Germany? Ancient DNA from skeletal remains allows researchers to trace paternal lineages through the Y-chromosome. Certain haplogroups, commonly associated with early Germanic-speaking populations, appear in regions far east of the traditional Germanic zone. At the same time, maternal lineages tell a more complex story, one of mixing, absorption, and cultural exchange. These people were not isolated invaders passing through. They lived there. They raised families there. They buried their dead there. And they left behind a genetic footprint that survived conquest, language shifts, and centuries of rewritten history. Archaeology supports this disruption. Material cultures once labeled as peripheral or non-Germanic, weapon styles, burial practices, settlement layouts, are now being reinterpreted in light of genetic evidence. What looked foreign begins to look familiar. What looked local begins to look shared. The map starts to blur. And then comes the historical silence. Roman authors, our main written sources on Germanic peoples, only described tribes once they entered Rome's sphere of interest. Anything beyond that frontier simply didn't matter to them. Entire centuries of population movement happened off the page. DNA fills that silence, but it does so without caring about later ethnic labels. To genetics, these ancient people are not German, Slavic, or Russian. They are lineages, clusters, continuities, which leads to the central tension of this story. If ancient Germanic genetic roots extend deep into modern Russia, then ethnicity is not a static inheritance from a single homeland. It's a process, a long negotiation between movement, memory, and identity. And that forces a harder question. How many modern identities are built on stories that began far from where we think they did? In the next part of this investigation, we follow the genetic trail itself, tracing how these lineages moved, split, and survived across empires, migrations, and cultural collapse. Because once DNA enters the narrative, history stops being a straight line and starts looking like a web. To understand how ancient Germanic populations ended up so far east, scientists had to abandon modern maps and return to something far older: inheritance. Not borders, not languages, not political names. Inheritance. The investigation begins with the most conservative part of the human genome, the Y-chromosome. Passed almost unchanged from father to son, it preserves deep ancestral signals far better than surnames or myths ever could. When researchers compared Y-chromosome data from early Germanic burial sites in Central and Northern Europe with ancient remains found in Eastern Europe and Western Russia, the results were unsettlingly consistent. The same paternal lineages kept reappearing. Haplogroups commonly associated with early Germanic-speaking populations were present far beyond the expected range, not as isolated outliers, but as recurring patterns in cemeteries dated centuries before the Slavic expansions of the early Middle Ages. This mattered because it meant these men were not late arrivals, mercenaries, or medieval settlers. They belonged to populations already rooted in those regions during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. In other words, long before Germany existed as a concept. But paternal lines alone don't tell the whole story. So scientists turn to mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line. And this is where the narrative takes its first sharp turn. While the Y chromosome suggested continuity and deep roots, mitochondrial DNA revealed diversity. Women buried alongside these men often carried lineages common among local Eastern European or steppe populations. This combination tells a very specific story. Not conquest, not mass replacement, but integration. Groups carrying early Germanic paternal ancestry moved eastward or emerged within eastern zones and formed long-term communities by intermarrying with local women. Over generations, culture and language could shift, but the genetic signal remained layered rather than erased. This pattern appears again and again. The farther east researchers looked, the clearer the structure became. Germanic-associated Y chromosomes embedded in mixed populations, not standing apart from them. So, how did these lineages get there in the first place? The answer lies in geography. Not modern geography, but the ancient landscape of rivers, forests, and steppe corridors. Northern and Eastern Europe were never isolated regions. Long before written history, they were connected by vast trade and migration networks following river systems like the Vistula, Dnieper, and Volga. These routes allowed people, goods, and genes to move gradually over centuries, not in dramatic invasions, but in slow demographic tides. Archaeology reinforces this picture. Burial customs associated with early Germanic cultures, specific weapon deposits, cremation practices, and grave orientations appear intermittently across Eastern Europe and into Western Russia. For decades, these finds were explained away as influence or trade. Genetics removed that safety net. The people buried there were not imitators. They were biologically connected to populations traditionally labeled Germanic. And yet, they were not culturally frozen in time. Material culture changes as these communities move eastward. Local styles appear. Hybrid traditions emerge. The genetic core persists, while identity adapts. This forces a critical reassessment of what Germanic actually meant in antiquity. It was not a race, not a nation, not a fixed homeland. It was a cultural linguistic network tied together by shared ancestry, traditions, and memory, flexible enough to survive relocation, but stable enough to remain recognizable in DNA thousands of years later. Historical sources, limited as they are, accidentally support this view. Roman writers encountered Germanic tribes only once they reached the imperial frontier. They assumed those tribes had always lived just beyond it. Everything further east simply fell outside the Roman imagination. But genetics sees what Rome ignored. The Goths provide the clearest example. Later historical records describe Gothic movements from the north toward the Black Sea region, territory overlapping with modern Ukraine and southern Russia. Ancient DNA now suggests that these movements were not sudden migrations from Scandinavia, but part of a much older demographic presence in the east. Some Germanic-associated lineages were already there, which flips the narrative. Instead of Germanic peoples spreading outward from a single European core, the data suggests a broad zone of interaction extending deep into Eastern Europe, a zone that later fragmented into distinct identities as political and linguistic boundaries hardened. This also explains a long-standing archaeological puzzle. Why do early medieval Slavic populations show genetic overlap with earlier groups that predate Slavic languages? Because they didn't replace them entirely. They absorbed them. As languages shifted and identities were redefined, older lineages persisted beneath the surface, invisible to chronicles, but preserved in bones. And this brings us to a crucial realization. Modern ethnic labels tell us very little about ancient reality. The people living deep inside what is now Russia during antiquity were not German, in any modern sense, but some of their ancestors would later be counted among the Germanic peoples of Europe. Identity moved. Names changed. Genes endured. In the next block, the story narrows to a specific mechanism that shaped these populations dramatically, a process that explains both genetic concentration and long-term continuity, the founder effect. Because when small groups migrate, history doesn't just move, it compresses. Once the genetic trail is mapped, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, one that explains how relatively small populations could leave such a durable imprint across vast territories. This pattern is known in population genetics as the founder effect. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. When a small group breaks away from a larger population and settles in a new region, it carries with it only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. Over time, that limited genetic pool becomes amplified, not because it is dominant, but because it is isolated. For ancient Germanic-associated groups living far east of their supposed homeland, this mechanism was decisive. These were not massive migrations of entire peoples. They were splinter groups, extended families, clans following rivers, trade routes, or ecological opportunities. Once settled, they didn't disappear. They stayed. And in staying, they became genetically distinctive. Ancient burial sites across Eastern Europe and Western Russia show exactly this pattern. A narrow range of paternal lineages repeated across generations, combined with more diverse maternal ancestry from surrounding populations. This is not random. It reflects a social structure in which male lineage and cultural identity were preserved, while marriage connected the group to its environment. The result was stability without stagnation. These communities remained recognizable over centuries, even as languages, technologies, and political landscapes shifted around them. This explains why genetic markers associated with early Germanic populations appear so concentrated in some eastern regions, and nearly absent in others just a short distance away. It wasn't conquest that spread them. It was survival. Isolation also reshaped identity itself. Cut off from their Western relatives, these Eastern groups adapted. Cultural practices changed. Material styles evolved. But ancestry remained a quiet constant, invisible but persistent. This challenges one of the oldest assumptions in historical thinking, that ethnicity follows culture. In reality, the relationship often runs the other way. Genetic continuity can outlast language. Memory can survive without texts. Identity can exist without a name. As centuries passed, these Eastern Germanic-linked communities found themselves surrounded by new demographic waves. Steppe populations moved west. Early Slavic groups expanded. Political alliances shifted. Some groups were absorbed. Others vanished. But some persisted long enough to leave measurable genetic echoes in later populations, echoes that modern science can still detect. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it suggests that modern populations in parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe may carry ancestral components inherited from peoples we no longer associate with those regions at all. Not because they are Germanic today, but because identity is layered, not replaced. This also reframes how we understand cultural disappearance. When historians say a people vanished, what usually disappeared was their language or their name, rarely their descendants. Genes do not migrate on schedules. They remain. They recombine. They wait. And then, thousands of years later, they surface in datasets that no one expected. The founder effect also explains why some traits, genetic, cultural, even mythological, appear amplified in certain populations. When a small group carries a particular tradition, belief, or genetic variant, isolation turns it into a signature. This mechanism shaped everything from burial customs to social hierarchies, and in later periods, even susceptibility to certain genetic conditions. But in the ancient world, the most important consequence was continuity. These communities did not need to dominate to endure. They only needed to remain coherent. And coherence does not require size. It requires shared ancestry, shared memory, and shared reproduction. Over time, the outside world changed its labels. What Rome once called barbarians became Goths, then something else, then disappeared into medieval categories. But beneath those shifting names, ancient lineages continued moving forward, generation by generation. The story of ancient Germanic presence deep inside modern Russia is not the story of lost Europeans in the East. It is the story of how populations fragment, adapt, and survive, and how identity can be preserved biologically even when it dissolves culturally. This is why genetic evidence is so disruptive. It doesn't flatter modern narratives. It doesn't respect borders. It reveals continuity where history assumed rupture. And it forces us to confront a final, deeper question. If ancestry can persist without culture, and culture can survive without ancestry, then what, exactly, defines a people? The answer lies beyond genetics alone. In the final block, the investigation widens again, connecting these ancient patterns to modern identity, and asking what this hidden history means for how we understand ourselves today. When all four layers of evidence are placed together, genetics, archaeology, geography, and history, the discovery stops being about ancient Germans in modern Russia. It becomes something larger. It becomes a lesson about how human identity actually works. The genetic traces found deep inside Eastern Europe do not mean that modern populations are secretly something else, or that ancient peoples belong neatly to modern nations. They mean the opposite. They show that the past was far more fluid than the categories we inherited. Ancient Germanic-associated lineages existing far east of their expected range reveal a world where populations overlapped, merged, and separated without asking permission from future borders. People moved slowly, often invisibly, along rivers and forests. They formed families long before they formed flags. This is why DNA unsettles historians. Written sources record moments, wars, names, encounters. Genes record continuity. And continuity does not care when a language changes or a political identity collapses. The people buried in Western Russia 2 or 3,000 years ago did not know they would one day be discussed as part of a Germanic question. They lived local lives. They adapted to local conditions. Their identity was probably defined by kinship and memory, not geography. Yet their descendants carried something forward. Not a culture, not a name, a lineage, and lineages endure. This forces us to abandon the idea that ethnic groups are born in a single place and then spread outward unchanged. What the evidence suggests instead is a network, populations branching, reconnecting, and diverging over long periods of time. And that network, Germanic, was never a fixed origin point. It was an outcome, a convergence of ancestry, language, and historical circumstance that solidified much later than the genetic roots that supported it. This is why ancient DNA from regions deep inside modern Russia feels so disruptive. It exposes the scaffolding beneath identity, the structure that existed before names were attached. It also reframes the idea of migration. We tend to imagine migration as dramatic movement, entire peoples on the march, conquering new lands. But most human movement is quiet. A family relocates. A clan follows a river. A generation grows up somewhere else. Multiply that by centuries, and the map transforms, without ever making the history books. The presence of ancient Germanic genetic components in eastern regions fits this pattern perfectly. These were not invasions. They were slow integrations, communities forming, stabilizing, and then being absorbed into something new. Over time, newer identities layered on top of older ones. Slavic languages spread. Political centers shifted. Religious frameworks changed. But beneath all of that, ancestry persisted. This does not mean modern identity is an illusion. It means it is incomplete. Identity is not only blood, and it is not only culture. It is the tension between them. The story of these ancient populations shows that genetic heritage can survive without conscious memory, while cultural identity can exist without genetic continuity. One does not cancel the other. They coexist. This is why modern DNA studies so often produce uncomfortable results. They don't tell people who they are. They tell people where complexity lives. And complexity is not something nations are built to handle. The deeper lesson of this investigation is not about Germans, or Russians, or any single group. It is about the danger of assuming that modern categories reflect ancient reality. The past was not organized for our convenience. It was messy, interconnected, human. When we look at ancient DNA, we are not uncovering secrets meant to redefine identities. We are uncovering evidence that identity itself is layered, contingent, and constantly rewritten. The skeletons in those eastern burial grounds are not proof of misplaced Europeans. They are proof of shared human history. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. Because if the chromosomes in our cells still carry stories written thousands of years ago, then none of us come from just one place. History is not only written in books, it is written in us.